All right, now we're going to continue where we left off in the part one video. So we were talking about these shifts in aggregate demand, and our list of shifters is here. So we have changes in consumer or firm confidence, fiscal policy, and monetary policy. All right, so when we have an increase in consumer confidence or business confidence, this means that consumers or firms feel more confident about the future of the economy. And when this happens, consumers will tend to consume more and businesses will tend to invest more because they're expecting a larger payoff in the future from that investment. So when this happens, we're going to see a rightward shift in aggregate demand. So our original aggregate demand curve is here at AD0, and our original equilibrium point is at E0, where AD0 intersects the short run supply curve. When consumer or firm confidence increases, we have a rightward shift in the aggregate demand curve. And so then our new aggregate demand curve is here at AD1. So when this happens, we're seeing a new equilibrium point here at E1. And this new equilibrium shows us that there is an increase in real GDP or total output and an increase in the price level as well. So what we want to focus on here is that these changes in consumer or firm confidence may reflect something that's truly happening in the macroeconomy, such as an expansion in this situation. Because consumers and firms are more confident, they may be accurately reacting to news that there is an economic expansion that is really happening. On the other hand, these shifts might be caused by news or other political events that aren't directly related to what's happening in the economy. So, based on certain news events, maybe election results, war, or even just statements about the economy made by prominent figures, this can shift consumer firm confidence, even if there is no real change in the macroeconomy. So, just to give an example here, if a president comes out and says that they expect a recession, this could reduce consumer and firm confidence, and this would actually shift our aggregate demand curve to the left. So this is actually why presidents in the US tend to avoid using the word recession, and recession is considered to be a dirty word in politics because saying there could be a recession can actually create a self-fulfilling prophecy where consumers and firms will reduce consumption and investment, and this can actually reduce output in the real world. All right, now we're going to talk about fiscal policy changes as a shifter of aggregate demand. So, first up, we have government spending. And because government spending is one of the four components of aggregate demand, changes in government spending are a very direct influence on aggregate demand. So, when the government decides to decrease its level of spending, this will reduce aggregate demand, and we'll see a leftward shift in our aggregate demand curve, as we see on the graph here. On the other hand, if the government chose to increase spending, this would increase aggregate demand, and the graph would look similar to it as it did here. So, tax policy is the other fiscal policy that governments have at their disposal, and they can use it to manipulate consumption and spending. So, when the government decides to increase taxes, this is reducing the level of disposable income that households have available to them. Or if this tax is on firms, it's going to reduce the money that firms have to work with. So consumption and investment will be discouraged, depending on who's paying the tax. So when this tax level increases, again, we would see a decrease in aggregate demand, and our AD curve will shift to the left. When we see a decrease in government spending or an increase in tax, this is going to move us to a new equilibrium point where total output is reduced and prices, the level of prices are also reduced. On the other side, if the government decides to cut taxes, this is going to increase disposable income for consumers and boost consumption, and it could also promote investment from firms. So in that case, we would see an increase in aggregate demand. The last aggregate demand shifter that we're going to show is monetary policy or a change in the interest rate. So central banks in any economy or country have the ability to manipulate the interest rate, and in doing so, they can affect aggregate demand by encouraging or discouraging consumption and investment. So when interest rates are low, this means that the price to borrow money is reduced. So when you take out a loan, you have to pay back interest. And when interest rates are lower, this means that you'll be paying back less interest on that loan. So this will incentivize households to make large purchases, things like cars or other big purchases that people typically take out loans for. And this will also encourage firms to make more investments, which are typically done through loans. So when we have lower interest rates, this is going to increase consumption and investment, and this will cause the aggregate demand curve to shift to the right. When this happens, we're moving from point E0 as our equilibrium to point E1, and this is resulting in an increase in total output and an increase in the price level. On the other side of this, if interest rates are higher, this means that borrowing is more expensive. So you'll be paying back more interest on the same loan. So when interest rates are higher, this will discourage households and firms from borrowing, and this will reduce consumption and investment. And in that case, we would see a leftward shift in aggregate demand. And again, only one graph is shown here, but in that situation, our graph would look like this. All right, now we're going to talk about how we show periods of economic growth or periods of recession in the ASAD model. So in the aggregate supply and aggregate demand model, we can show economic growth over time as a gradual rightward shift in both of our aggregate supply curves. So as we know, economic growth is driven by increases in productivity. And when we have increases in productivity over an extended period of time, we would see continual rightward shifts in our short run and long run aggregate supply curves. So in this graph, we're covering 3 periods. We have period 0, which is our initial period. Then we have period 1 and period 2. So in this graph, we're illustrating continued economic growth through productivity by showing rightward shifts in our short run aggregate supply curves and in our long run aggregate supply curves. So when we're talking about shifts in aggregate supply, it's important to note that only changes in productivity can shift the long run aggregate supply curve. And this is because the total GDP that can be produced at full employment is increasing when our productivity is increasing. In this graph, we're talking about how we can show economic growth, but obviously the factors that are determining the speed of this growth are not showing up directly in the model. We can only infer that there must be increases in capital, education, or technology when we're seeing these continual rightward shifts in aggregate supply. All right, to show a recession in the ASAD model, we are going to depict the equilibrium point as being below our potential GDP or our LRAS curve. So in the short run, GDP falls and rises in any economy. Whether the economy is going into a recession, GDP will go down. And if the economy is coming out of a recession and expanding, GDP will go up. So when we want to depict an economy as in a recession on our ASAD graph, we're going to draw the economy as having an equilibrium point that is significantly below our potential GDP. And so in this graph, we're showing that here at point E0. Whereas if we wanted to show a period of surging economic growth, we would shift our AD curve to the right, and we would land at an equilibrium point that is much closer to our full employment output level. All right, so far in our discussion of the equilibrium in the ASAD model and talking about shifts, we've been kind of skirting around this idea of what is a recession versus a period of economic expansion and what that implies for unemployment, inflation. So what we've said so far is that when the economy is operating at an equilibrium point that is close to the level of potential GDP, that we're in a period of growth, there's low unemployment, things like that. Whereas when we're at a point that is more significantly below potential GDP, we expect a recession and we expect higher unemployment. Now we're going to dive into how we actually look at unemployment and inflation in the ASAD model. So, in our unemployment chapter, we discussed the difference between short term or cyclical fluctuations in unemployment, and we contrasted those with the natural rate of unemployment. So, cyclical unemployment is caused by changes in the business cycle, meaning that when there's a recession, we expect cyclical unemployment to increase. And when there's a period of economic expansion, we expect cyclical unemployment to decrease. On the other side of that, we have the natural rate of unemployment, which is caused by structural and frictional unemployment. Those are the types of unemployment that never really go away, whether or not we're in a recession or an expansion. So in the ASAD model, we are able to show cyclical unemployment through how close that equilibrium point is to the full employment level of GDP. So going back to this graph, we would expect that at point E0, cyclical unemployment would be higher than it is at this point E1. And that's because at E0, our economy is operating further below potential GDP. So we know that that must mean that not all factors of production are employed. So some people must be unemployed, some factories must not be operating at full capacity, things like that. Whereas if we're closer to our potential GDP, like at point E1, this means that our cyclical unemployment rate is lower. So next, we're going to talk about inflation in the ASAD model. And inflation fluctuates in the short run, with higher rates of inflation typically being associated with periods of economic expansion and lower rates of inflation being associated with recessions. So in the ASAD model, there are two possible ways that we can have an inflationary pressure on the level of prices. This would be an increase in inflation or an increase in the level of prices. First is what we call overheating. So this happens when aggregate demand continues to increase when the economy is already very close or at potential GDP. So when we have a situation of overheating, prices are increasing without an increase in productivity, simply because productivity cannot increase anymore. It's already at the maximum. The other option here that can cause inflationary pressure is a rise in input prices that affects most industries in the economy. So, as we talked about with aggregate supply shifts, if there's an increase in the price of energy or there's an increase in wages, this will shift aggregate supply to the left. And in this situation, the increase in input prices is going to be passed along to the price of outputs. So, when firms experience higher prices for inputs, they will usually raise the prices for outputs to sort of offset their cost. And so, because of this, we will see an increase in the price level for outputs. All right, so here we have an example of overheating on our graph. So we're imagining that our economy is moving from 80 to 81. So we have an increase in aggregate demand. However, this increase is occurring when the economy is already relatively close to potential GDP. And what happens in this graph is that we're actually seeing that aggregate demand is pushing the equilibrium level of output above potential GDP. So in the short run, the economy may be able to produce here, but what's happening is that firms are competing to produce more when there's really no additional resources available to do so. So what happens is that firms have to pay more for workers, they're competing for capital, paying more for capital, and what happens is we see an increase in the price level. The other way that we can have an inflationary pressure that we show in the ADAS model is through the increase in input prices. So when the price increases for a widely used input in the economy, this is going to shift our short run aggregate supply curve to the left. So from SRAS 0 to SRAS 1 in this graph. And when this happens, we see that it pushes up our equilibrium price level. So there's an increase in the level of prices for outputs. And the reason for this is because when it becomes more expensive for firms to produce their products, they don't want this increase in the cost of production to cut into their profits. So what they do is they turn around and they raise the price of their products, their outputs. So that is what is causing this increase in the price level for outputs in our economy. The last thing we're going to cover here is we're going to return to our discussion of whether supply or demand are the main drivers in an economy. So, what we actually find is that the ASAD model can be used to illustrate both Say's law and Keynes' law. And the way that we do that is we actually divide up our short run aggregate supply curve into multiple sections, and each section will, showcase that different school of thought. Once we've divided up our short run aggregate supply curve, we can actually use this as a diagnostic test to determine how an economy is doing. All right, so the first zone that we can divide our SRAS curve into is the Keynesian zone. And the Keynesian zone I've shown here in purple is the flattest portion of the short run aggregate supply curve. When we're in the Keynesian zone, GDP is far below the potential or full employment level. So if the aggregate demand curve is crossing the short run aggregate supply curve in the Keynesian zone, as it's doing here, then the equilibrium level of real GDP is far below potential GDP. And that's what we're seeing here is at our equilibrium in the Keynesian zone, our actual level of total output is pretty significantly below our potential GDP, which is marked by the LRAS. So from this, when we see this type of intersection, we conclude that the economy is in a recession. It's producing far below its potential GDP. This means that there's, more unemployment, so cyclical unemployment is high, and inflationary pressure on prices is not a large concern. And the reason for this last one is because even if aggregate demand were to increase, or if, short run aggregate supply were to decrease, because we're at this flat portion of the curve, these changes are only going to cause a mild increase in the level of prices. Next, we have the neoclassical zone, which is the steepest portion of the SRAS. And in this portion of the curve, GDP is very close to or at the level of potential output. If the aggregate demand curve is crossing the SRAS in this neoclassical region, as we're showing here, then we know that the equilibrium level of output is actually very close to potential GDP. And from this, we know that cyclical unemployment must be low because the economy is very close to that full employment level of output. And in order for the size of GDP to increase, we would actually need to see a rightward shift in aggregate supply. So we're kind of maxing out here. So what we would need to see is a productivity increase. Aggregate supply would need to increase in order to allow the economy to produce more. Lastly, if we were to see an increase in aggregate demand here, we would see inflationary pressure on prices. So this is going back to our discussion that we just had on inflation. If aggregate demand were to increase, then we would see an upward pressure on prices because firms are forced to produce more when they really don't have the means available to them to do so. And our last zone here is sort of that Goldilocks zone, which is the intermediate zone. So this is the portion of the SRAS curve that is still below potential GDP, but it's not so far below as it was in the Keynesian zone. And this area of the curve is still upward sloping, but it's not nearly as steep as it was in the neoclassical zone. If the aggregate demand curve is crossing the short run aggregate supply curve in this intermediate zone, we expect unemployment and inflation to move in opposite directions. So, for example, if we were in this area and we saw a rightward shift in aggregate demand, then this would of course move our output closer to potential GDP, and this will result in a reduction in unemployment, but there will be some mild increase in prices, as we can see here. So our output is increased, it moves towards potential GDP, but there is also some increase in the price level. On the other hand, if we had a reduction or a leftward shift in aggregate demand while we're in this region of the SRAS curve, we would see a decrease in total output and a mild decrease in the level of prices. And because we're moving further from potential GDP, this would represent a increase in unemployment. So more people would be unemployed. And we actually see a downward pressure on prices here. So the level of prices can actually be reduced in this situation. So what we see here, just to recap, is if we're in the intermediate zone and aggregate demand increases, unemployment would go down and inflation would go up. On the other hand, if aggregate demand decreases, unemployment would go up and inflation would go down. So we have an opposite direction there. All right, now we're going to continue on and we're going to work on some practice problems. So, in these types of problems where you're asked to use the ASAD model to show some sort of effect on the economy, you will usually be presented with an event. You'll have to draw that event on the graph, show how it affects the equilibrium, and then there will be some questions about what happens to our key features of the macroeconomy. So, what happens to output, employment, and inflation or the price level. So, first off, you can see I've started out by drawing our graph. So, this is how you can draw your graphs for this. We always want to be labeling our axes and our curves. So, our x axis will be labeled with GDP, which you can abbreviate as Y for output. Our y axis you can label with price level or PL for short. And then we have our downward sloping aggregate demand curve, which we've labeled AD, our upward sloping short run aggregate supply curve, and our long run aggregate supply curve or potential GDP labeled as LRAS. So before we even start with reading the problem, we also want to identify our original equilibrium point. So that's what we're going to do first. So our equilibrium point is the point at which our short run aggregate supply intersects our aggregate demand curve. And we'll label this as well. Let's label it E0. And this equilibrium point is telling us our equilibrium output level and our equilibrium price level before any changes have occurred. All right, now we're ready to read our problem. And our problem is asking us to show the effects of a tax cut on the aggregate supply and aggregate demand graph. So we want to go back and think about our shifters and say, okay, if there's a tax cut, is that shifting aggregate demand or aggregate supply? And in our conversation for aggregate demand, we talked about how first aggregate demand can be represented by this formula. So we have output or demand is equal to consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. And so when there's a tax cut, this means that there's going to be an increase in consumption and investment if this is a tax on both consumers and producers. So let's say here, let's imagine that it's just a tax on households or individuals. So when our tax rates go down, this means that we're going to have more disposable income. So we're going to see that increase in consumption. When consumption increases, that is going to drive up aggregate demand. So our new aggregate demand curve will be shifted to the right. And we'll be sure to label this. And we can even draw an arrow to show which way our curve is shifting. All right, now that we've drawn our new demand curve, we want to identify our new equilibrium point. And this is going to be useful for us when we're trying to answer these questions about what happens to output, unemployment, and price level. So our new equilibrium is where our new AD curve intersects the SRAS curve. And we can label this point as well. And so what we see is as a result of this increase in aggregate demand, there is an increase in output or GDP. So we know that output will increase And when output increases, we're moving closer to full employment GDP. So, because of that, we know that unemployment must be decreasing. So, more people are employed. Lastly, if we go look at the y-axis, we see that this increase in aggregate demand has increased our price level. So, there's been some sort of upward pressure on prices. This has caused the price level to increase. All right, for our second problem, I've gone ahead and I've drawn our completed graph here. So when you're working on these problems, make sure that you label everything, label your original equilibrium, so that you have a nice clean starting point for assessing these problems. All right, this problem is asking us to show the effects of a negative shock to aggregate supply. So this is one of our aggregate supply shifters. It's telling us right in the problem that there's going to be a decrease in aggregate supply. So for example, this could be something like, a negative shock to some sort of input good. So if there's a negative shock to, major crops like wheat or corn or energy prices, this could cause a negative shift in the aggregate supply. So we'll show that on our graph well, here, I'm going to do it like this. We'll show that on our graph by shifting our aggregate supply curve to the left. And again, we're going to label our curves. So this is our new one. And we can draw an arrow to show that shift as well. All right, so when there's this negative shock to aggregate supply is reduced. And in identifying our new equilibrium point, we see that there is a decrease in total output. So as a result of this shift, output decreases. And because output is decreasing, we're further away from our potential GDP or our full unemployment GDP. So we know that unemployment must be increasing. Fewer people are employed, so we're not producing to our full potential. So unemployment will increase. And lastly, looking at the y-axis, we see that our equilibrium price level has increased. So as a result of this shift left in the SRAS, there is some upward pressure on prices. So prices in the economy are increasing. All right, our last problem here is to show the effects of an increase in productivity on the ADAS graph. So once again, we're starting from our complete, fully set up original equilibrium graph. And when we have an increase in productivity, we know that this means that the current quantity of workers is able to produce more. So when we have an increase in production, this is an increase in aggregate supply. So we'll first draw our new short run aggregate supply curve. And we'll be sure to label our curves. All right, so when we have this increase in productivity, not only does our productivity increase in the short run, but because workers are able to produce more, this actually means that our potential GDP has increased. So all workers or workers on average are producing more output. So the maximum output that we can produce has also increased. So this means that we'll also see a shift to the right in our long run aggregate supply curve. And we'll label this curve as well. All right. Now we want to identify our new equilibrium so we can see what's happening to our different economic factors. So remember, our equilibrium is where aggregate demand intersects the short run aggregate supply. And we'll label this point. And so what we see is that there is an increase in total output. So output is moving up because we're able to produce more with higher productivity. So output is increasing. And because output is increasing, this means that unemployment is likely decreasing. So because workers are more productive, we're producing more, unemployment should be decreasing. We're in an expansionary period. And lastly, we actually see that there is downward pressure on prices. So because production is more efficient, we're seeing a downward pressure on prices. Okay, that's it for this video. I know this is kind of a long one, but this chapter is really the culmination of everything that we've learned so far in the semester. We're putting it all together and analyzing things simultaneously. So if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me via email. And if not, I'll see you in the next one. Thanks.